Okay, welcome back to our session on influenza vaccines. If Dr. Talbot, if you're ready, please give your introduction.
Completely ready. Okay. So next slide. I want to thank everyone. This has been an incredibly busy year, even though influenza was not circulating like it normally does. But we've had quite a group of ACIP members, ex officio members, and liaison representatives and consultants who've really worked through the influenza issues that we'll discuss today. Next slide. So recent work group discussions have included the following: developed or proposed updates to the ACIP influenza statement for 21-22. And this includes the timing of vaccination, co-administration of influenza vaccines with COVID vaccines, contraindications and precautions, and also a change in indication of the Flucelvax Quadrivalent down to a younger age group. We'll also have presentation of results from Immunogenicity and Safety study of Flucelvax Quadrivalent among children 6 through 47 months of age, and it's currently approved for ages 2 years in age and older. Next slide. So today's session overview is going to include Flucelvax Quadrivalent Phase III Randomized Controlled Trial, Immunogenicity and Safety data in children ages 6 months through 47 months. And then Dr. Grosskopf will talk about the considerations and proposed recommendations to the influenza wording. Next slide. I think that's everything.
Okay, then we'll go forward. Dr. Sylvester, would you please talk about Flucelvax Quadrivalent Phase III Randomized Controlled Trial, Immunogenicity and Safety in children 6 to 47 years?
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Greg Sylvester, and you just heard the title of my presentation. So this is a randomized clinical trial that is the first immunogenicity and safety study that included infants and toddlers aged 6 months through 23 months, although you can see that we heard that it is already licensed for 24 months and above. The results of this study have already been submitted to the FDA. Seqirus is asking for a label expansion down to that 6-month age group. You all use the initial CCIIV4. For simplicity of this presentation, I'm just going to say Flucelvax. Next slide, please. This slide is an outline of my presentation, and as you review it, I want to remind you that influenza causes considerable morbidity and mortality in young children. In the US, the CDC estimates 20,000 children under the age of 5 are hospitalized every flu season due to influenza complications. Vaccination remains the most effective means of preventing influenza disease. Next slide. Influenza is the only cell-based influenza vaccine licensed in the US and avoids egg adaptation by being manufactured in mammalian cells. Thus, cell-based vaccines may be a closer match to the annual FDA-selected influenza virus strains. Influenza, as noted earlier, has been approved for use this past March in anyone 2 years and older. Next slide, please. This study was conducted as a non-inferiority study. CBER, within FDA, has established clinical data guidelines when employing this type of design. In a moment, I'll present the results of each viral strain contained in the vaccine. Using the CBER recommendations, we pre-specified that the geometric mean titer would not exceed 1.5, and the serum conversion rate differences would not exceed 10 percentage points, both for the upper bound of the 95% confidence interval for each of the 4 influenza strains. That means that there are 8 co-primary endpoints that are used by the FDA to assess vaccine efficacy in a non-inferiority clinical trial. As with all vaccine trials, we collect adverse events, local and systemic, as well as solicited and unsolicited. Next slide, please. This phase 3 trial compared Flucelvax to a U.S. licensed influenza vaccine. In our case, we used Afluria Quadrivalent as our comparator vaccine. We conducted this study during the 2019-20 Northern Hemisphere flu season in 47 centers in the U.S. Immunogenicity was assessed using hemagglutination inhibition assay for influenza A, H1N1, B Yamagata, and B Victoria strains, and a microneutralization assay for the A, H3N2 strain. Children were randomized to either receive Flucelvax or the comparator vaccine in a 2-to-1 ratio. Twice as many would get Flucelvax as Afluria. We stratified the children by vaccine status. You'll see that on the next slide. Next slide, please. This slide depicts the study overview of infants and young children who were not previously vaccinated or who had an unknown influenza vaccination history. Starting at the top right-hand side of the slide, you can see that when the vaccines were administered, then going down just a little further, you can see when the blood draws occurred to collect the blood to do the immunogenicity. And then at the very bottom, you can see all the way across the collection of adverse events. These children received 2 doses of influenza vaccine because they had not been previously vaccinated. So first dose was done when they enrolled on day 1, and then they returned a month later or 29 days later and received their second dose. And as you can see, we do solicited adverse events 1 week after their vaccination. So this cohort of children did 2 solicited adverse events groups. During the entire study period, we collected and evaluated all AEs, which included new onset chronic disease and serious adverse events. Next slide, please. This slide diagrams the study flow of children who were previously vaccinated. We defined a previously vaccinated child as anyone had received 2 or more doses of influenza vaccine at least 4 weeks apart. Blood sampling was done in similar fashion for immunogenicity, and that was performed again on day 1 and then 30 days after the vaccine, so on day 20, at the end of the month. Safety assessment was collected and evaluated in the same manner as those that were not previously vaccinated. Next slide, please. Here is a list of some of the more common key inclusion and exclusion criteria that we used in this clinical trial. I'd like to point out that for acute febrile illness or fever, we define that as an oral temperature of 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit or above. And as you can see, that was an inclusion criteria in the study. All right, next slide. Here are the demographics of the children participating in this study. You can see the 2 groups were well matched. If you look at the last column on the right, and we'll start at the top right-hand side and work our way down, you'll see the mean age of the study population was just a little bit over 28 months. In the next row, you'll see that there was a greater preponderance of children over the age of 24 months in the study. It was a near equal distribution for boys and girls in the study. And row 4, or the middle of the table, shows the race makeup. Nearly 2/3 were white and almost 25%, or over 25%, were Black or African American. When evaluating ethnicity, nearly 30% stated that they were Hispanic or Latino, as you can see in the second to last row. And finally, the last row shows that there were slightly less than half the children who were not previously vaccinated, which means a bit more than half were. Now for the results. Next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we evaluated 8 co-primary endpoints to assess immunogenicity. Here are the 4 geometric mean titer ratios results, and they're presented both on the left and on the right side of the slide. So the far right, you can see the geometric mean ratios, and in the graph, they're depicted as the geometric mean ratios. The graph shows vaccine strain on the x-axis and the GMT ratio on the y-axis, with the dotted red line is that predefined margin of 1.5. So the table on the right side has both the individual GMTs as well as the GMT ratio on the far right-hand side. The bolded numbers are the upper bound of the confidence limit for GMT ratio, and all are below the predefined criteria. Next slide, please. Here are the results of the additional 4 co-primary endpoints, the seroconversion rate differences. As you can see, all 4 vaccines did not exceed that predefined margin of 10 percentage points of the upper bound of a two-sided 95% confidence interval on the difference between seroconversion rates. This slide is set up similar to the previous one. On the left side is a graph showing the differences in seroconversion for each of the 4 strains. And on the right side, you see individual seroconversion rates as well as the seroconversion rate differences on the far right-hand side with the bolded numbers, which are the upper bound of that 95% confidence limit. Using the CBER guidelines, all 4 strains met all 8 predefined co-primary endpoints. Next slide, please. Here is a summary slide of the solicited adverse events. And as I said earlier, we solicited AEs during that 7-day period after vaccination. Now, if we start on the left-hand side of the graph, these are the most common reported local adverse events, and you can see that they're similar in both, and you can also see that tenderness and erythema were the two, number 1 and number 2 AEs reported for local solicited adverse events. Looking on the right side of the graph, the most frequently reported systemic adverse event, solicited now, was irritability and sleepiness in both groups. The other part of the slide that I want you to focus on is that the majority of the solicited local and systemic adverse events were considered mild or moderate in severity. And you can see that by that, in fact, after each one of the small bars to the right are the severe. So severe tenderness, severe erythema. You can see that the vast majority are mild or moderate. Next slide, please. Here is a summary of the unsolicited AEs. A number of AEs were reported, and only 4.5% within each group was determined to be related to the vaccine. Both groups reported similar serious adverse events at less than 1% or 0.9%, but none of the serious adverse events were assessed as being related to the study vaccine. AEs leading to NOCD, or new onset chronic disease, were reported at 1.4% for Flucelvax and 1.6% for the US licensed comparator. 2 of the 3 withdrawals, that 2% comes up to 3 people in the Flucelvax. There were 3 that withdrew on the Flucelvax side. 2 of those, unfortunately, were deaths. One child died of an adenovirus encephalopathy. Another died in a car crash. The 3rd withdrawal was due to new onset seizure. None of these withdrawals were related to the vaccine. And then my last slide. In summary, Flucelvax met all 8 predefined co-primary endpoints. The immunogenicity data was consistent against all 4 strains, and Flucelvax was well tolerated when comparing AEs amongst both groups. This safety data is consistent with previous reported data in older children. Now, looking forward, Securus expects an FDA approval of this expanded age range for Flucelvax in mid-October, prior to the October ACIP meeting. It is our hope that you will vote to expand Flucelvax coverage down to 6 months in the VFC program. Thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sylvester, for that very informative presentation. I see that Dr. Chen from the voting members of the ACIP has a question. Dr. Chen, please.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sylvester. That was a great presentation of that information. I was wondering if you have the safety and the immunogenicity information broken down by age groups among this population, the 6-month-old to 12-month perhaps, and then older or other kind of age strata.
Yeah, so can you forward past my next slide is the backup, and then let's go to the next one. So here it is by age 6 months to 2 years, right? To 20 up, it's through, not to, through 23 months. And so you can see the breakdown. The light green, the first circle, is that overall, and then the blue square is that younger age group, and then the older age group is the red diamond. And this is your GMT ratios by age group, okay? Now, the study was not powered to assess immunogenicity by this, but we still did it anyway. And then the next slide is our seroconversion rate differences by age with the same. The light green is overall, the blue square is the younger children, and the diamond is the older children. And again, you can see this study was not powered that way, but you can see the results of that. I can tell you that we looked at adverse events and broke it down in this, but we didn't see any appreciable differences. There were no real differences between the 2 groups. So I don't have a slide for that.
Thank you very much for that answer. Dr. Paling, please.
Thank you for making sure that the study population represents the United States and is diverse. And following that line of thought, have you evaluated the results of both immunogenicity as well as the safety by race and ethnicity?
Well, I don't know. I can certainly go back and ask my clinical development colleagues, the ones that did this. We actually had a fairly diverse population, and when I came in October and presented that 4-month and 4 years and above, it wasn't as diverse. But I don't think we did a sub-analysis, but I will be happy to look into that, and I'll report that back to Lisa Groskopf, Dr. Groskopf.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sylvester. Any other questions from the voting members? I'll open it up to the liaisons. There is one from Dr. Lee. Please, Dr. Lee.
Thank you. I was wondering if you could just give us a little bit more information about the serious adverse events. I'm asking, first it's just trying to understand the age of the individual with overwhelming adeno infection and whether or not there were any comorbidities. And the second would be just understanding a little bit more about the new onset seizure disorder again, and if there were any risk factors that were known previously, and the age group, if you can't speak about the age specifically.
Yeah, I do have some information, but I don't have any specific information on either one of those cases. I'll be happy to go back into the CSR and dig that out and present that. When we defined new onset of chronic disease, these are the reports that we got back. We had 3 children with asthma, 2 children with seasonal allergy, 2 children with ear infections, may have been otitis media, and 2 children with allergic dermatitis on the Flucelvax side. And on the other side, the comparator showed two cases of cardiac murmur. The most common side effects were bruising at the site of infection and irritability. But that's as much information as I have right now in front of me, but I'd be happy to get more for you.
Thank you.
Dr. Maldonado.
Yes, thank you so much for this presentation. We were just curious, given the wide array of vaccines available, where do you think that the price point for this vaccine will fit relative to other flu vaccines for children?
I'm a little lost at words. I'm not on the commercial side. I'm the lead for medical affairs. It is a licensed vaccine currently, and so I think that they would charge the same amount in this age group as for the vaccine in a 4-year-old or a 10-year-old or something else. So whatever our current price is, and I apologize, I don't have that in front of me, is the price that this would be for 6 months and above.
Thank you for that answer. Are there any other questions from either the voting members or the liaisons? I'm not seeing any, so thank you again, Dr. Sylvester, and we'll move on to the next presentation, which is work group considerations and proposed recommendations for the 2021-22 influenza season by Dr. Groskopf. Dr. Groskopf, please take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, and good afternoon. Next slide. So before getting started, I'd just like to thank not only our work group members who were listed on the second slide in Dr. Talbot's presentation, who we're really profoundly grateful for, but also the CDC staff and others who have contributed to our work over the course of the year. Despite now more than a year of having a lot of other very high priority things to do, we've been really blessed to have amazing turnout and amazing exchange of information and dialogue on every call, and we meet twice a month. So we're very fortunate to have that, and I'm just really, really grateful to everybody that's continued to participate. Next slide, please. So today I'm going to go over the proposed updates for the ACIP influenza statement for the upcoming 2021-22 influenza season. And as Dr. Talbot alluded to, even though there wasn't much flu activity going on over the course of the past year, we had a pretty light season. We did have a lot to talk about, and that'll be a little bit evident as we go through. So first, I'm just going to give an overview. Next slide, please. So this is just an overview of the main thing that hasn't changed and the things that we're proposing to change. The core recommendation for the upcoming season is unchanged, and that is that annual influenza vaccination is recommended for all persons aged 6 months and older who do not have contraindications. The draft statement, however, contains updates in a number of areas, and these include the influenza vaccines expected to be available for the 2021-22 season, the U.S. influenza vaccine viral composition for the 2021-22 season, a change in age indication for Flucelvax Quadrivalent from greater than equal to 4 years to greater than equal to 2 years, several changes to the language concerning timing of vaccination, new information on co-administration of influenza and COVID-19 vaccines, and some changes to the contraindications and precautions language, specifically concerning persons who've had a previous severe allergic reaction to either influenza vaccines or a component of influenza vaccines. Next slide, please. So first, we're just briefly going to go over the influenza vaccines expected to be available for the 21-22 influenza season. Next slide. So this chart summarizes the 9 influenza vaccines that are expected to be available for the upcoming season by their approved age indications. As previously, we have three main types of vaccines: the inactivated vaccines, or IIVs, recombinant vaccines, or RIV, and the live attenuated influenza vaccine, or LAIV. All of these three categories are expected to be available. One change this year is that all of the vaccines are going to be quadrivalent. That is, they will contain hemagglutinin derived from 4 different viruses: one influenza AH1N1, one influenza AH3N2, one influenza B Victoria lineage, and one influenza B Yamagata lineage. And this will be the first season that that's happened. Last year, we had a total of 10 vaccines available, and we still had one trivalent, and that we understand now will no longer be available for the season, so this will be the first season that we have all quadrivalents out. A second change is that, as mentioned in the top slide, the age indication for Flucelvax Quadrivalent has been changed from 4 years and up to 2 years and up. This was approved by FDA in March, and we'll talk about that a little later. In this chart, green denotes egg-based vaccines and blue denotes the non-egg-based vaccines. Out of our 9 vaccines, 7 out of the 9 are egg-based. That is, they contain influenza viruses that have been propagated in eggs, and the other 2 are not. And those would be the cell culture-based vaccine, Flucelvax Quadrivalent, which contains virus propagated in canine kidney cells, and the recombinant vaccine, Flublok Quadrivalent, which doesn't use viruses in its production, but rather contains hemagglutinin produced via introduction of the hemagglutinin protein's gene sequence into an insect cell line using a viral vector. Next slide, please. So next, just a brief discussion of the 2021-22 vaccine viral composition. Next slide. So for the 21-22 U.S. influenza vaccine, U.S. influenza season, FDA met early in March to make recommendations about the vaccine viral strains that are to go into U.S. licensed influenza vaccines. And for this season, they are recommending a composition for the vaccines that contains updates in both the influenza AH1N1 PDM09 component and the influenza AH3N2 component. The B components are the same. And since for this season we are expecting only quadrivalent vaccines, there isn't, the option for the second B. They're both there. We don't specify that it's for the quadrivalents only. So essentially, we have updates in the 2 A strains. Another thing that I'm going to mention just briefly, only because it's a relatively common source of questions. In the last couple of years, from VRBPAC, we've seen separate recommendations for the egg-based and the non-egg-based vaccines. Those would be the cell culture-based and the recombinant vaccines. This doesn't mean the composition of the vaccine is different in any meaningful way for any subtype of virus that's recommended. There are generally a number of antigenically similar viruses that can be used. And since the development and further development of the cell culture-based vaccine, it's now actually possible to use cell-based reference strains in the cell culture-based vaccine. So sometimes you'll see separate recommendations. It does not mean, however, that the vaccine is different. Those are antigenically similar viruses that you'll see. In this case, they've only specified a difference for the influenza AH1N1 PDM09. Next slide, please. So next, change in age indication for Flucelvax Quadrivalent, or CCIIV4, as we call it. Next slide, please. So we just heard a presentation on data for this vaccine for ages 6 through 47 months, but you may remember we had a presentation of data in October 2020, 2 meetings ago, and there was a change in age indication from 4 years and older to 2 years and older that was approved in March by FDA. So this is a vaccine, again, that was previously licensed for 4 years and up. It's now licensed for 2 years and up. The change is supported by a randomized trial conducted among over 4,000 children aged 2 years through less than 18 years over 3 influenza seasons who were randomized 1-to-1 to get CCIIV4 or Flucelvax Quadrivalent and a non-influenza control vaccine. Overall vaccine efficacy was 54.6% for RT-PCR or culture confirmed influenza-associated CDC-defined influenza-like illness, and was somewhat higher for matched strains at 62.7%. Again, these data were presented to ACIP in October. For a proposed draft language, the new age indication is reflected in the text in Table 1, and as we generally do when we have a change in age indication, there is a paragraph on it in the section in the recs about licensure changes. Next slide, please. section on co-administration of influenza vaccines with other vaccines. This is specifically focused on co-administration with COVID-19 vaccines. Next slide. At the time of the publication of the last statement in August 2020, COVID-19 vaccines were not yet available, and since they now are, and we're also coming up on the first season, influenza season, for which co-administration of influenza and COVID-19 vaccines can occur, our work group has been closely following the recommendations coming from the COVID-19 vaccine work group on co-administration. And initially, as you probably remember, it was recommended that COVID-19 vaccines be spaced at least 14 days apart from any other vaccines. However, this was recently updated and is posted under the clinical considerations for use of COVID-19 vaccines on the CDC web pages. For our purposes, there is a section in the ACIP influenza statement on co-administration of influenza vaccines with other vaccines, and this has been updated to reflect the most recent guidance for the COVID-19 vaccines. In discussing this topic and considering what recommendations to make, one consideration discussed by the work group was the potential for increased reactogenicity, particularly with co-administration of some influenza vaccines, which might be more likely to cause any kind of reactogenicity symptom. For example, for flu vaccines specifically, in some studies that have compared, for example, adjuvanted vaccine with unadjuvanted inactivated vaccine, or high-dose inactivated vaccine with standard dose inactivated vaccine, some of those studies have shown a slight increase in some reactogenicity symptoms, generally mild. And so those are the two vaccines we would probably think of in this particular regard. But in the U.S., both of those vaccines are only licensed for 65 and older. Individuals 65 and older tend overall to have less reactogenicity than younger people, and neither of these vaccines is licensed for children. So that was one area that was discussed. For another thing that was discussed was the importance of not missing appointments for vaccination and opportunities for vaccination, which could easily be happening and be more of a concern if people are not able to get vaccines at the same time. And this has been a particular worry, as I know has been discussed, regarding children missing routine vaccinations. It's going to be a concern for adults who require influenza vaccination. So this was another concern that was discussed and considered by the work group. In the end, the language arrived at in the draft statement is consistent with the most recent COVID-19 vaccination guidance. We are following their lead on this. And the language also refers via referral to the URL providers to the most recent guidance for any updated information in the event that anything should change over the course of the summer and into the fall. Next slide, please. So here, copied on the slide, is the guidance from the interim clinical considerations for the use of COVID-19 vaccines currently authorized in the United States, which state COVID-19 vaccines were previously recommended to be administered alone with a minimum interval of 14 days before and after administration of any other vaccines. This was out of an abundance of caution and not due to any known safety or immunogenicity concerns. However, substantial data have now been collected regarding the safety of COVID-19 vaccines currently authorized by FDA for use under EUA. Further, COVID-19 vaccines and other vaccines may now be administered without regard to timing. An additional point made is to administer the COVID-19 vaccines and vaccines that might be more likely to cause a local reaction, for example, tetanus toxoid and adjuvanted vaccines, in different limbs if possible. Next slide. So our proposed language for 2021-22 in the influenza statement essentially mirrors the current COVID-19 vaccination guidance and is as follows. Current guidance concerning administration of COVID-19 vaccines with other vaccines, and then the URL is cited, indicates that these vaccines may be given with other vaccines, including influenza vaccines. No data are currently available concerning co-administration of currently authorized COVID-19 vaccines and influenza vaccines. Providers should be aware of the potential for increased reactogenicity with co-administration and should consult CDC guidance at the reference link for updated guidance as more information becomes available. If co-administered, COVID-19 vaccines and vaccines that might be more likely to cause a local reaction, for example, adjuvanted or high-dose vaccines, should be administered in different limbs if possible. Next slide, please. Our next topic is timing of vaccinations, which is always a complex issue, and this time we have several updates. Next slide. So before launching into the updates, some background on this topic and two factors that have some bearing on decisions regarding timing of influenza vaccination. The first concerns timing of the influenza season. The ideal time to be vaccinated against influenza each season really can't be predicted because the timing of the onset and peak of the influenza activity beginning varies from season to season. Timing of activity onset can also vary geographically, with the circulation of influenza viruses varying in different parts of the country. In the United States, localized areas of increased activity occur as early as October. And as far as peak activity, over the last 36 seasons between the 82-83 season and the 17-18 season, peak activity, which generally corresponds to about the midpoint of the influenza season, occurred in December during 7 or 19% of seasons, in January during 6 or 17% of seasons, February during 15 or 42% of seasons, and in March in 6 or 19% of seasons. So while there's definitely a mode at February there being the most popular of the seasons for the influenza peak to occur, you can see that there is a bit of a spread in the distribution. And in fact, we even had a couple of seasons where the peak activity was actually quite early. Only one season each for October, November, but it has happened. So in the chart, essentially, we can see that while February is the peak, there is some variability involved. Next slide, please. A second factor is waning protection from vaccines and vaccination with time following vaccination. For the past several years, since approximately the 13-14 season, the influenza statement has included a fairly lengthy discussion of the evidence for waning protection following vaccination during the influenza season. Declines in vaccine effectiveness over the course of the season have been observed in many observational studies, and while there's some variation in the findings among the studies, it generally appears that waning is more common and more pronounced among older adults. Also, there's been less evidence of waning among children. Next slide. So based upon the factors that were just discussed in the current 2020-21 statement on sort of where we are at baseline before we make any changes, vaccination has been recommended to be offered by the end of October. And the end of October has been a time point that we've referenced for several seasons now, and also recommended to continue as long as influenza viruses are circulating in the community locally. The language has also, for the past couple of seasons, included a recommendation that July and August are probably too early in most influenza seasons, especially for older adults. And the reason for probably really comes down to having to do with the variability of timing of the onset and peak of the season. We can't really make an absolute judgment about those things. So based on when seasons are likely to begin and likely to peak, that's been the language that we have used. An exception to this July and August language was made for one group, and those are children ages 6 months through 8 years who require 2 doses for the season. And as you probably remember, children 6 months through 8 years of age, if they are vaccine naive, they haven't received influenza vaccine before, or if they've only in their lives ever received 1 dose, they need 2 doses for that season in order to be considered fully vaccinated. And for these children, receipt of the first dose is recommended as soon as possible after vaccine is available in order to allow enough time for the second dose to be received by the end of October, since the doses need to be administered at least 4 weeks apart. Next slide. In discussing timing of vaccination language this year, we kind of had a broadening of our scope a little bit. The work group discussed recent literature concerning waning of immunity to influenza vaccines. Other considerations discussed included protection of infants during the first months of life, avoiding missed opportunities for vaccination, and language that resulted from this contains several changes concerning timing of vaccination for children, persons in the third trimester of pregnancy, and adults. Next slide, please. So we're going to go over each of these groups and describe what's the same and what's different. And the new is in red in these slides. And for children, we'll start with them. There are actually two sentences that refer to children in the new guidance. And for children, the first segment concerns the children 6 months through 8 years who need those 2 doses. This really hasn't changed. As in previous seasons, some children in this age group either have never received flu vaccine or have only ever received a single dose. We need 2 doses spaced at least 4 weeks apart. For this group of children, the language reads similarly to recent previous seasons, and that is children aged 6 months through 8 years who require 2 doses should receive the first dose as soon as possible after vaccine becomes available to allow the second dose, which must be administered at least 4 weeks later, to be received ideally by the end of October. And the ideally was an addition for this year. And the second part with regard to children, which is new, is specifically referring to children who need only 1 dose, who were not called out specifically in the last few years. And this is because there are fewer data reflecting the significance of waning immunity among children, and also concerns about this population missing vaccinations. The new sentence has been added, which is in red, stating, children of any age who require only 1 dose for the season should also ideally be vaccinated by the end of October. Vaccination of these children may occur as soon as vaccine is available, as there's less evidence to suggest that early vaccination is associated with waning immunity among children as compared with adults. Next slide, please. The next group is pregnant persons during the 3rd trimester. And this was an addition given with respect to the fact that it has been demonstrated in a number of trials that vaccination during later pregnancy can result in increased protection to the infants from influenza during the first few months of life. And this is generally a period of time where they're not going to be eligible for influenza vaccine because we currently have no policy for vaccinating children under 6 months, nor do we have any vaccines that are licensed for children who are under 6 months of age. This addition reads as follows. Vaccination soon after vaccine becomes available may also be considered for pregnant persons during the 3rd trimester, as vaccination of pregnant persons has been shown to reduce risk of influenza illness of their infants during the first months of life, a period during which they will be too young to receive influenza vaccines. Next slide. So finally, everybody else, non-pregnant adults. And there's not a huge modification here. It's basically mostly modified because all the other groups have been taken out, but we also strengthened some of the language with regard to July and August. This now reads, as proposed anyway, for non-pregnant adults, influenza vaccination during July and August should be avoided unless there is a concern that later vaccination might not be possible. We don't want people to miss opportunities for vaccination, but it was felt that it was important to be mindful of the fact that for many adults who need only 1 dose, particularly older adults, July and August during most seasons based on timing are likely to be too early. Next slide, please. So the last area where we have some proposed modifications concerns updates to influenza vaccine contraindications and precautions. These changes pertain specifically to severe allergic reactions such as anaphylaxis to either influenza vaccines or their components. Next slide, please. So first, a little bit of background on these kinds of reactions and influenza vaccines. All vaccines, including influenza vaccines, include multiple components that can potentially trigger severe allergic reactions, for example, anaphylaxis, although that would not be the only category of severe anaphylaxis one would be worried about. Serious allergic reactions to influenza vaccines and vaccines in general are fortunately rare. As an example, a vaccine safety data link or VSD study by McNeil et al. From 2016 estimated the rate of post-vaccination anaphylaxis among cases that involved administration of a single vaccine, so not multiple vaccines administered at the same time, as 1.31 cases per million doses for all vaccines and 1.35 cases per million doses for a trivalent inactivated influenza vaccine or IIV3. Next slide, please. One of the complexities of severe allergic reactions to vaccines is that they can occur in people who have no prior history of allergic reaction to a vaccine or perhaps even to anything. And also that when a recipient does experience a severe allergic reaction, it can be difficult to know which component was responsible for the reaction. And one of the things mentioned in the ACIP General Best Practices document is referral of the individual to an allergist for evaluation is usually indicated to possibly determine the component responsible before making decisions regarding administration of the additional doses of the same vaccine or other vaccines that have the same components. And this is language that's not specific to flu vaccines. It comes from the general recs, but it is representative of the uncertainty sometimes that we have in determining when somebody gets a reaction to something, determining what caused it, and then trying to decide the best course going forward. Next slide, please. So as far as the current 2020-21 language concerning severe reactions to influenza vaccines, this is actually located currently at the end of the egg allergy section. It's the final bullet in the 2020-21 recs in that section, having originally been placed there for the 2011-12 season in order to make clear the difference in management between individuals who have egg allergy and individuals who have had a severe allergic reaction to an influenza vaccine previously. And that mainly is that whereas allergic individuals are recommended to receive influenza vaccines, the recommendation states that a previous severe allergic reaction to influenza vaccine, regardless of the component suspected of being responsible for the reaction, is a contraindication to future receipt of the vaccine. This language is consistent with the contraindication language that is in most of the egg-based inactivated influenza vaccine package inserts. At the time this language was developed, those were the vaccines that were available. We didn't have newer non-egg-based vaccines yet at that time. But the majority, basically those package inserts said as of the 11-12 season, with minor variations, that a previous severe reaction to an influenza vaccine let me just clear my throat here. History of severe allergic reaction, e.g. anaphylaxis to any component of the vaccine, including egg protein, or after a previous dose of any influenza vaccine was a contraindication. And by minor variations, I mean in some package inserts, they don't say e.g. anaphylaxis. In some package inserts, they say following a previous dose of any influenza vaccine. But for the egg-based influenza vaccines, that is still the standard language across those vaccines. Next slide, please. The package inserts for two relatively newer influenza vaccines, those being the recombinant influenza vaccine RIV4 or Flucelvax Quadrivalent, and the cell culture-based inactivated vaccine Flucelvax Quadrivalent or CCIIV4, have somewhat different contraindications language in the package inserts. They instead read history of severe allergic reaction, e.g. anaphylaxis to any component of the vaccine, and don't include history of a severe allergic reaction to any influenza vaccine as a contraindication. In the current statement, in the table of the contraindications and precautions, all inactivated influenza vaccines, or IIVs, including the cell culture-based inactivated vaccine, are grouped together with contraindication language mirroring that of the egg-based inactivated vaccines. That is, history of severe allergic reaction to any component of the vaccine or to a previous dose of any influenza vaccine. For RIV4, the table acknowledges that the language in the package insert is different, that is, history of severe allergic reaction to any component of the vaccine. While this accurately reflects the package insert language, it presents an inconsistency with the language noted on the previous slide that comes from the egg allergy recommendations, indicating that a severe allergic reaction to any influenza vaccine is a contraindication to future receipt of the vaccine. Next slide, please. So in discussing this, there were a number of things that the work group considered and that were topics of conversation. So one is that there's a desire to have consistency and also, to the extent possible, simplicity of recommendations. Simplicity is both especially important to aim for and a particular challenge to get to in the context of multiple vaccines with differences in labeling. Grouping of similar vaccines within a category with the same language, for example, as with the inactivated vaccines, helps simplify the recommendations, but sacrifices differences between the specific vaccines. Another point with harmonization with the influenza vaccine package inserts, which also poses a challenge to simplicity. Also discussed were the relative components of the currently available influenza vaccines based on the components listed in each package insert and their similarities and differences with one another. An additional point was the desire to be able to extend vaccination to those who had had a severe allergic reaction to an influenza vaccine if an alternative vaccine could be safely used. Finally, there was some discussion of potential need for allergy or immunology consultation. While this was recognized to be a useful step in determining causative components of a reaction and in identifying potential alternate vaccines, it was also noted by some in the group that allergists, particularly in some parts of the country, are in relatively short supply and are not always easily accessible in all communities. Next slide. So one other consideration that was discussed was reviews of vaccine adverse event reporting system data, or VAERS data, that were published by Wu et al. And these reviews examined reports of adverse events, including allergic reactions following recombinant influenza vaccine, or RIV. Before summarizing these data, just a reminder regarding limitations of VAERS. VAERS is a passive surveillance system and has the potential for reporting bias. There's also potential for inconsistent data quality and incompleteness of data. And finally, in general, VAERS data cannot be used to assess causality. Next slide. So the reviews by Wu et al., which were essentially reviews of reports of reactions in VAERS, evaluated reports of cases of allergic reactions, including severe allergic reactions following recombinant influenza vaccine. The focus was on such reactions as a whole, but there was some focus on some of the severe allergic reactions. The vast majority of reactions that were found were not severe. This is a vaccine that's egg-free, contains no antibiotics or gelatin or preservatives, and as far as ingredients or components listed on the package insert, has relatively fewer than many other vaccines. It was noted that there were cases of allergic reactions, including some meeting Brighton criteria for anaphylaxis, and among those, some among persons who had reported a history either of allergic reaction to eggs or to a previous dose of influenza vaccine. Now, this vaccine doesn't contain eggs, so the authors weren't trying to make a point that it was something to do with eggs, but what they note in the papers is that the occurrence of such reactions might reflect an underlying predisposition to Acip, which might lead to reactions following any vaccine or medication, rather than to indicate a specific causative relationship to the constituents or components of any specific vaccine. In other words, people who are allergic to things might be more likely to react to other things as well, and this might not be something that we can easily predict, and it might be a factor with just about any other vaccine we could give. Next slide. So given all of this discussion, we arrived at this, and this is essentially a copy of the draft table 2. LAIV has been removed from it because no changes have been proposed there, so this basically only contains the relevant sections for our conversation this afternoon. And one thing that became necessary to try to be as clear as possible is that the cell culture-based inactivated vaccine is now pulled out into its own row in the table. The egg-based vaccines are as a group up top, and RIV4 was always in its own group, so that's the other third row there. So the changes here, in addition to the fact that we pulled out CCIIV, is that the contraindications read for CCIIV, history of severe reaction to CCIIV4, CCIIV3, which is no longer available but a similar vaccine, just trivalent, or to any component of CCIIV4, which is the current formulation. For RIV4, the language reads history of severe allergic reaction to RIV4, RIV3, or any component of RIV4. For the egg-based vaccines, those vaccines, that language retains as a contraindication a history of previous severe reaction to any other influenza vaccine, which is consistent with what's in those package inserts. Because of uncertainty regarding what might have caused an allergic reaction, should somebody have an allergic reaction to any influenza vaccine, we have moved some items and added some items into precautions. So for CCIIV4, first two precautions are the same. A moderate or severe acute illness with or without fever, that was a precaution when it was nestled under the egg-based vaccine. Ditto for history of Guillain-Barré syndrome. What was added was history of severe allergic reaction to a previous dose of any other influenza vaccine, that is other than CCIIV. So that would be egg-based IIV, RIV, or LAIV. And the numeric designators are left out there because these people could have had an allergic reaction prior to the availability of quadrivalent vaccines, so we include only the general categories there. Those would cover both trivalent and quadrivalent. For the recombinant influenza vaccine, there is a similar, more parallel, I guess, precaution draft language there. History of severe allergic reaction to a previous dose of any other influenza vaccine, i.e., any IIV or LAIV. Next slide. In addition to the proposed contraindications precautions changes, there are some proposed footnotes concerning the precautions. One is that if CCIIV4 or RIV4 is administered to an individual with a history of severe allergic reaction, for example, anaphylaxis to any other influenza vaccine, vaccination should occur in an inpatient or outpatient medical setting and be supervised by a healthcare provider who is able to recognize and manage severe allergic reactions. It also notes that providers can also consider consultation with an allergist to help determine the vaccine component responsible for the allergic reaction. Next slide. So that ends my presentation of the proposed updates for 2021-22, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Groskopf, for that extensive review of the changes and updates and clarifications in this year's document. Does anyone have, from the voting members, have any questions regarding the presentation? Dr. Long, please go ahead.
Yes, I have several, and I don't know, Dr. Romero, if you want to discuss some of these issues in buckets, because it was a beautiful presentation as always, but there were several different topics. So I don't know. I'll just take the first topic that she presented, and then maybe you want to see if others have anything to say about that, or I have questions about every topic. So the current guidance indicates that vaccines may be given with other vaccines. The fact that we keep saying that doesn't make it more correct or indicate that there is more evidence. So I wonder, number one, we certainly don't have at the moment any information about concurrent administration of coronavirus vaccines and the newest influenza vaccine. But I wonder if we will have data that will come along, or that there's a special way in which we can look at that. I'm thinking about the adolescent now, who we know is at some increased risk of myocarditis, and we do not understand what the pathophysiology of that is, but we think it has something to do with the altered response to something in that vaccine. That person, especially if the AAP has their way, they will want this person to get potentially HPV vaccine, the influenza vaccine, coronavirus vaccine, and maybe even Tdap all at the same time. And how do we know that that won't increase the likelihood of myocarditis or some other hypersensitivity event? And how do we know that there will be immunogenicity that's equal for more than one vaccine together? That's the first part of my question. I don't know if Dr. Groskopf wants to comment on that. I have a second part to that question.
Dr. Groskopf, do you wish to make a comment on that or just go to the second?
Why don't we, just so I don't forget the details of the first one, why don't we start with this one?
Okay.
Those are excellent points, and it is true that we are dealing with limited data at this point. If Dr. Oliver were here, I would also invite her to comment. It's hoped that we'll have more information going forward. We are aware of one trial that's going to happen that's going to be sponsored by our Immunization Safety Office with the CISA project group. That, however, is not going to start till the fall. I think that, from the discussion on the work group, and I believe this is somewhat indicated in the wording in the COVID-19 vaccine recommendations, a lot of the reason for the spacing at the beginning was abundance of precaution, and also to have some ability to be able to collect distinct safety data on that vaccine and not have the picture muddled potentially by somebody having received COVID-19 vaccine and another vaccine. It's always difficult to sort out safety when multiple vaccines are being administered. We don't have a lot of co-administration data in a lot of settings. Probably most of what we do have is in early childhood vaccination. I'm not aware that there is as much in adolescent vaccination. Of course, those children are older and they don't get as many vaccines, although there is that period in the early to mid-teen years where there is a cluster of them. So I do see your point there.
Dr. Groskopf, this is Dr. Cohn. I can also add on behalf of Dr. Oliver, Dr. Long, yes, we do not know in terms of immunogenicity, but we do have a preprint from one study that looks at seasonal influenza vaccines in Novavax that does show similar immunogenicity with no issues as well as safety. And additionally, and there were no changes in either influenza titers, antibody titers at all. In addition to the CISA study that Dr. Groskopf mentioned, there are some other studies that are ongoing that we do anticipate getting data back from earlier than the fall. And certainly we will address any concerning issues that may arise from either this study or from any reports if they occur, if any sort of adverse event occurs in a person who has had vaccines co-administered. Thank you.
May I ask the second part of that, Dr. Romero?
Yes, you go forward.
This is on the same subject, slightly different. Yesterday we had such an in-depth discussion about the concern and the numbers and the warning about the myocarditis. We didn't get to the second part, which is our responsibility to attempt to mitigate adverse events associated with vaccines. So maybe Dr. Cohen can also answer, if Dr. Oliver also is not on the line, I'm interested particularly in whether someone is trying to understand if for adolescents and young adults, if the second dose of an mRNA vaccine should either be further apart than 4 weeks, or should the second dose be a smaller dose? And I wonder if somebody is looking at some of these things so that we can fulfill that second responsibility, which is attempt to try to mitigate adverse events.
Sure, Dr. Long, I can answer that. So this is related, just to clarify for everyone, this is a question about COVID vaccines, not influenza vaccines, but just to make sure everyone understands, but there is a lot of work going on to look at varying doses of vaccines, and there's some activities that are happening amongst the companies. I don't know if anybody from any of the companies wants to respond, as well as trying to understand when adverse events such as myocarditis occur, trying to understand the risk factors and the potential reasons, such as how many days between doses 1 and doses 2, and those types of questions, to determine if there is any relationship between the timing of doses and an adverse event. Thirdly, at this time, we don't have a lot of data on safety or efficacy of second doses of COVID vaccine outside the at least the 42 days. We certainly have a lot of people who have received vaccines, not within the exact period of time, but we are looking at analyses, such things like whether or not there's differences by date, by spacing between doses. Unfortunately, there's just there's so many important questions, and a lot of these studies require a lot of additional data and time to really sort through. So I don't know what types of answers we'll have before the end of the summer, but we will continue to keep the ACIP updated on those things as they progress.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Cohn.
That's terrific. I have some more buckets, but I don't want to manipulate or hog the microphone here. Whatever, Jose, I don't see other hands up, but what do you want to do?
So let's do this. I was going to say there was nobody else, but let me give Dr. Lee a chance to ask her questions and Dr. Maldonado, and then I'll come back to you if that is okay with you.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Lee.
Thank you. Sorry, I have just a quick question regarding one of the last slides that talked about a history of severe allergic reaction. And, it's very specific language that it should occur in an inpatient or outpatient medical setting. I'm wondering if we should be reframing things as anyone who administers vaccine should be prepared to, be able to deal with anaphylaxis. Of course, there may be situations where that's not possible, but I just worry that this language is too restrictive. And I'm thinking about, a lot of vaccines are delivered in pharmacy settings, but it's not specifically called out here, or in nursing homes, or perhaps in school settings or other community vaccination settings where they may be able to manage and handle it, but rather focus it less on the site and more on the capability to be able to support and manage anaphylaxis well.
Thanks. The focus overall is definitely on the ability to manage anaphylaxis, I think, and we've cited, for example, the need to be aware of the fact that somebody can have an allergic reaction even if they have no prior history. It can happen with any vaccine, and you really just can't predict that you're going to be able to have a situation where you don't need to worry about it. We also cite the guidance from the general recs regarding people being familiar, providers being familiar, and staff being familiar with the office emergency plan. The current language that is there is modeled largely on the language that's used in the egg allergy recs for vaccination of people who've had a history of anaphylaxis to egg. It's pretty much identical to that. And when that language was last discussed, I think my impression of the ACIP discussion at that time, and this was a couple of years ago now, was that on the one hand, facilities are told to have adequate personnel and equipment to be able to handle a severe allergic reaction should it occur. But I think there's some concern that that might not always be the case. So I'm only saying that as background as far as the genesis of that particular language.
Yes, no, totally understand. Thank you. I guess maybe perhaps taking a step back, making sure that as we're talking about anaphylaxis for a variety of different vaccines, that unless there's a rationale for a specific setting, that we try and think about, where we can harmonize that language to not confuse providers about, giving vaccine A in this setting, but vaccine B is okay in another setting. So just from that perspective, and also just because I want to make sure that we don't inadvertently create access issues if for some reason, some are stricter or less strict than others.
Yeah, it's definitely an overarching issue for sure. I completely see your point. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Maldonado.
Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for this. And we continue to be appreciative of CDC for your continued guidance and consensus building around all of these issues. And so I just wanted to say on behalf of the American Academy of Pediatrics that we continue to work, and not unilaterally, but in addition to ACIP, other CDC groups, other federal agencies and societies, to try to ensure that the vaccine schedule for children is as safe and effective as possible in preventing morbidity and mortality from diseases, as well as preventing as much as possible adverse events in children. And if there are adverse events, we are obviously at the forefront, along with you at the CDC, in making sure that those are addressed rapidly and some information disseminated to our 67,000 members. So just want to make sure that we all understand that these are not unilateral decisions. We're all working together here, and there are unknowns about COVID-19, but we do know that this disease is deadly in children, and the data are out there. HHS issued a statement yesterday, and we continue to believe that the best way to deal with COVID, as well as the other diseases that we know affect children and adolescents, is to make sure that everybody is as up to date on all their immunizations as possible. And obviously, we always have in mind potential for adverse effects, and discuss those with all of you here, as well as within AAP and their leadership. So thanks for that opportunity.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Maldonado. Dr. Grosskopf, did you want to say something?
Just thank you.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Daly.
Yes, I just have a brief comment to follow up on Dr. Long's comment. I think, Dr. Long, I appreciate the comments, and I'm going to probably just phrase it in a little different way, which is to say that I just think we need to strongly encourage additional study of the safety and immunogenicity of co-administration of COVID vaccine with influenza vaccine. I think it may be that this year, most adolescents will be vaccinated with COVID vaccination in the summer, and then they may receive flu vaccination in the fall. But then it may come up in the context of boosters. So it might be the fall of 2022 when these kids might need a booster of a COVID vaccination, and then influenza vaccination. So I think we just need to strongly encourage continued study of the safety and immunogenicity of co-administration, including influenza and COVID vaccination. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Goldman, please go forward.
Thank you, sir. A comment and a question. First, on the issue of co-administration, I also want to point out that in adults, we need to make sure we look at that, because I have less opportunities to co-administer vaccines to patients because they're not coming in as frequently or as scheduled as children do. So I have to make sure I maximize the opportunities to keep them up to date on the vaccine schedule as every single appointment and remind them of it. So we need to make sure that we also look at adult co-administration. But I did have a question about the timing of vaccines and the language used, because this comes up frequently with the adult population as well as children as to when and how early they should get it. And I'm wondering why it was said as it was to consider postponing it, as opposed to saying it the opposite way of make sure they vaccinate in September and October, as opposed to saying try not to vaccinate early, the negative versus the positive. And on top of that, the concern of the caveat after it, unless there's a potential shortage or it's not feasible to vaccinate later on in the season. You know, some of those issues we may not know right away. And so I'm worried that the way the language is written, it may not accomplish the goal of trying to get patients vaccinated at the optimal time, and it may create some confusion if they are concerned that they may not get the vaccine in a set time period, so they vaccinate early anyway, even though we're suggesting not to do it that early. I'm just wondering if there's perhaps a different way we can phrase it to make it very specific and clear, because what is happening in the community is that other vaccinators, non-physicians, are getting the vaccine dosages early before the doctors do, and they're giving them out right away to patients. And by the time they come to me, they may have already been vaccinated, even though it was July and August, and I may not even get my supply until September to appropriately vaccinate. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering if we can modify the language a little bit or change it to take that into consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. That is an excellent question, and it's such a complicated issue, and there's so many ways we could approach it. The current language surrounding July and August originated from a few factors, one of which, as you point out, there are some entities that do get vaccine, it seems, earlier than others. And it doesn't necessarily happen every season. It's not like vaccine is always out in July every season, but we have had seasons where there have been sightings as early as July. August definitely has happened. And these may be places that are away from somebody's medical home, for example, pharmacies, where they're not necessarily getting advice from their primary care provider about when might be the best place to do things. So that's part of why July and August, because as time has gone on over about the last 10 years, the production timelines for vaccine have changed. And, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, we wouldn't have had vaccine probably available as early as we do now, but sometimes now it happens. So that's one reason. The second factor in coming up with the July and August language, which was initially, I think, 2 seasons back, had to do with some work on modeling with different assumptions of when people were vaccinated and how likely they might be to come back if you deferred vaccination in July and August, as well as assumptions about vaccine effectiveness and onset of the flu season. And, modeling means putting in a lot of assumptions. You can get a fairly broad range of results, but it did look, one of the things that emerged from that was that July and August are probably too early during most seasons based on the historical average timing of flu seasons. It's a little harder to say things about September, and we also do want to allow some people some flexibility, not just the people getting vaccinated, but also the providers who have to deal with all the programmatic issues of getting the vaccine and setting up campaigns and making sure their office staff know what to do. That was really the main thing that it seemed to be that we could make a strong statement about at the time. It's certainly possible to refer to it instead of in the negative, don't do it here, do it here instead. But the do it here part is actually a lot broader, I think. And, that September is reasonable, October seems reasonable. We also want to make sure that people understand that if they don't get it in October, it's certainly not too late to do December or January or even later, because flu sometimes circulates as late as May. And if you are in January or February, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be in time for the peak, which is, statistically most likely to come in February. So I definitely appreciate that comment. And it is honestly a little bit of a challenge to figure out the best way to phrase these things and still make sure that people have some flexibility, particularly in the season where we're also going to be dealing with COVID vaccine, and it's going to be, maybe a bit more challenging than usual to get things done. I guess that remains to be seen. But at any rate, that's the genesis of the July and August phraseology that's been used for the last several seasons. I don't know if Dr. Talbot has anything to add.
Nothing to add.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. Dr. Paling, you had a question?
Yes, I've got more of a comment. So thank you, Dr. Groskopf, for a great presentation, very clear. And I want to thank you and the work group for all the work that you've done in talking about complex issues, in particular timing. That's been a really important component. And I very much appreciate your differentiating the data about weaning that is present for older adults and the lack of evidence about that for children, and giving pediatricians and family medicine physicians more flexibility. I think that is going to be important, and it is important for equity. And then I want to reiterate what Dr. Lee spoke about, because one of the things that became very prominent during for COVID vaccine is outdoor vaccine drives. And these can be done safely with watching for anaphylaxis and stuff. And so I do think we want to make sure we are promoting equity in the distribution of vaccine and careful with the wording. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Long, do you want to continue with your question or comment?
Yes, the question is somewhat related to what's being talked about right now, and it's a simple one. It's good news and not completely surprising that children's antibody doesn't wane as rapidly as older individuals. So the question is, I don't remember, Dr. Groskopf, if there were ages around this, what you were talking about as children, and being able to start July, August, where you make that cutoff. And the second is the recently licensed cell-based product down to the age of 2 years. Do we have the data to know that that influenza vaccine response also does not wane?
Taking the latter question first, I'm not aware that's not to say that there isn't anything. I'm not aware of anything specifically with the cell-based vaccine as far as duration of immunity. Most of the papers we look at tend to look at vaccines as a whole, most of them. And sometimes for some of them, it's actually not possible to determine what individuals received. As far as ages, among children for cutoffs, it's very tricky. In a lot of the waning of immunity studies, the age bands are pretty broad. And so there's generally not a lot of fine gradations in the pediatric population. There might be 2 to 3 age categories. Some of them are just 65 and up and then under. So it's a little bit tricky. There is one study, I believe, by Belongia et al., where they looked at distinct ages, so not really age ranges. So 2 years, 5 years, and then I think the next category up was somewhere in the teens, and then going up through adulthood. And in that particular study, there was an increased odds of developing influenza by week post-vaccination. That was sort of a trend among the very oldest and the very youngest in the population, although the very youngest wasn't pronounced. But then there have been recent other studies that have not seen a linear trend. And that's actually one of the frustrating things about it, because even when you look at the waning literature as a whole, there's a lot of variable results there. And, in addition to older age looking like it's fairly consistently a factor, in various studies that have looked at it by virus type and subtype, some of them have found differences. So I think this is still a moving target, and I think we probably need more literature in pediatrics to be able to pin it down a little further.
Well, I think it's going to be important if you're going to be advising about how offices give their influenza vaccines, you know, whether they can give them, a pediatrician or a family medicine doctor can give it to everybody under 18 starting in July, or only those 2 years to 18, you know, the responses under a year of age. I'm now a little bit concerned about the decision that has been made, has not been based on specific influenza data, but on general data. Did you mean to say that? About vaccine robustness of and the duration of antibody response to vaccines. Are you talking specifically here about knowledge of influenza vaccine responses, or are you talking about vaccines in general?
Lisa, would you like me to help out?
Go ahead, Dr. Talbot, is that you?
Yes.
Go ahead.
So Dr. Long, these are all great points. It was all based on influenza data and based on previous knowledge of how influenza vaccines work. So it was not specifically done on the cell culture, but in children that young, but in all influenza vaccines together as a unit. I think the point that the language was trying to make and the change was that you don't have to wait until October to start immunizing children, because you may miss that chance to give your second vaccine in children who need a second shot. So the point was not to start immunizing in July, but if you have a child in your office and if you have vaccine, which is highly unusual in July, and they need 2 shots, that you can begin that immunization process so that you can get your second vaccine in prior to influenza season. Hopefully that helps.
That makes a lot of sense. I don't think that's exactly what the words implied. So maybe there will be language around it that will, to make that clear. And you know, to say this about the cell-based vaccine, and there's not waning in children when we don't really know that yet, that seems a little bit hard to lump those together.
Dr. Long, you may have more questions, but let me go ahead to Dr. Lee, who has a question.
Please.
Raise her hand, and then we'll come back to you. Go ahead,
Thank you.
Dr. Lee.
I appreciate it. I forgot my other question, which is, well, first I just want to endorse the need for studies about co-administration. And I also wanted to just make the statement that I think there's a strong need to support diverse platforms for flu vaccines, and to ensure that we are not overly reliant on egg-based platforms, given the context of the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for pandemic preparedness for flu. I think, you know, it's really important for us to continue to make sure that that a variety of platforms are available for future use. I wanted to just maybe put in a request for, in the future, Dr. Groskopf, a review of the post-marketing safety surveillance activities with regard to flu, and perhaps just an update. I wanted to have a particular focus on CCIV, but also, you know, all of the various candidates that are available. So just wanted to ask if either CDC or FDA or both might be able to provide an update in the future, just on the experience to date historically with these vaccines. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Very good. Dr. Long, do you have anything else that you wish to bring forward?
I do. Are you willing?
Sure.
So the next question was related to the pulling out of pregnant ladies in your statement, Dr. Groskopf. So I guess we would want to just be sure that the language that would encourage them to be vaccinated also to protect their infants also doesn't override the primary purpose of influenza vaccine in pregnancy, which is to protect the pregnant woman from severe and fatal illness. So we wouldn't want anybody to wait until they would get closer to delivery or even to the 3rd trimester if they should be getting influenza vaccine earlier. But the question specifically is, you know, it's feasible then with your language that a woman comes to her obstetrician in February, she hasn't had influenza vaccine, she's beginning of she's in her second trimester, and she should be immunized. But then, from what you're saying, she could potentially get a second influenza vaccine when she was still pregnant in July and August. I don't think you intend that, but do you intend to exclude that from happening, or do you have thoughts about that?
Thank you. Yeah, no, that we actually would intend that in that particular scenario that there be a second vaccine in July or August, because by that time, it's a new influenza season. The influenza vaccines are essentially set to expire each year not later than June 30th. And so by the time you're getting to July, and in reality, it's probably going to be the very end of July, if it is July, it's the next season's vaccine, which would be indicated anyway.
But do you understand you could then get two influenza vaccines, maybe different, maybe the same, in the same pregnancy, and without any study of such a thing? Are you going to try to not have that happen, or? Am I not counting my months correctly?
No, you are. So you're talking
Somebody
about
gets
February.
it in February. Yeah, somebody gets it in February. Somebody got it this February. Okay, the 2021 vaccine. And then in July, August, from your things, you would really welcome her to get another dose of the 21-22 vaccine in July if it were available. Do you think that that's a good thing to happen? 2 doses of influenza vaccine in one pregnancy. One fetus gets 2 vaccines.
One thought about that is that by the time of the second exposure, that would be third trimester, and by that point, first of all, as far as specific data about getting 2 doses in one pregnancy, I'm not aware of any, and I welcome any input from Dr. Talbot if she is. But while overall the influenza vaccine safety data in pregnancy is pretty reassuring, there's been a very long history of use of influenza vaccines in pregnancy. I could not tell you that we have data on the number of times something like that just happens as a result of happenstance. It wouldn't surprise me if sometimes women are vaccinated twice in pregnancy, although I'm not specifically aware of any data about that. The second one would be during third trimester, which does change the risk profile of exposures during pregnancy in general. And that's also a period of time where we have more data on exposure to vaccines than we do during first trimester. But our current language doesn't make any specific reference to excluding that as a possibility, no.
I see that Dr. Hayes has her hand up. So, Dr. Long, I'm going to interrupt you at this point and ask Dr. Hayes to go ahead and ask her question.
Yes, Carol Hayes, American College of Nurse Midwives. I just want to point out that the 40 weeks of pregnancy overlaps 2 flu seasons in almost 2/3 of pregnancies. So it is completely reasonable that a woman would receive 2 different flu vaccines within each gestation. And that's completely reasonable and happens all the time.
Thank you for that information. Dr. Cohen, did you want to say something? No, okay. So, Dr. Long, not to limit you, do you have any other comments?
Are you asking me?
Wait a minute. We have, sorry, we have 2 other questions here. Dr. Foster, please go first.
Thank you, and Dr. Groskopf, thank you so much for your work and your committee's work too. I have, first of all, a comment about the timing issue. I like the fact that you say do not do it during July and August. It gives us some ammunition. And by the way, I'm the pharmacy representative for American Pharmacists Association. But I do have some concern about the wording for the warnings about giving the the co-administration of the influenza vaccine with COVID-19 vaccines. The question I'm going to get from providers with the way that it's worded is, should we avoid the high dose and the adjuvanted vaccine by the way that it's worded? Providers that are busy, and particularly those of us that are working under standing orders, really need to have a yes or no type of answer for doing that type of thing. The way it's wording, it kind of sounds like if someone reads that, they're going to say, no, I don't want to give those vaccines, and no, I should not use that. I'm not personally not real concerned about the fact that we give those with the high reactogenicity. As one of those seniors, I've reacted pretty well to a lot of the vaccines. But I'm just concerned that we spell out the two vaccines there. I think maybe if we just left those two things out, it would still raise awareness of the possibility, but it doesn't sound like we should avoid them. It sounds more like maybe we should use them, but maybe add the word education to the patient, if that might be the case. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next question is from Dr. Sanchez, please.
Thanks, Dr. Romero. No, I think that the issue with the pregnancy and the number of doses, actually I think that's a really important point that we need to, and it's being done. I'd like to, if Dr. Alt could comment on it as well. It's something that should be included, because if it's being done, then we should study it and affirm that it's safe, but it makes sense that you're protecting the woman during two different seasons. So I think some comment to that effect just to make some would be helpful. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Freihofer.
Sandra Freihofer, American Medical Association, speaking as a practicing physician about the reactogenicity question. As a general internist who sees patients in the office every day and is on call every night, I am the one that gets called when two very reactogenic vaccines are given at the same time. So I greatly appreciate that clarification of which flu vaccinations are particularly reactogenic. And, you know, the option is to possibly get them at different times, or at least make the patient aware and give them a choice. And this is a little more complicated than just, you know, giving the same thing to everybody. But I think it's important for patients to understand what to expect so they won't be concerned. And since I'm the one that gets called, I would greatly appreciate that education on the front end too. So I like the current wording that's been suggested by the work group.
Thank you. Dr. Alt, your comment, please.
Well, I'm trying to think of the timing here. I mean, most people that are in the first trimester and at the end of a prior flu season, you know, in February and March, in my clinical experience, a lot of them would have been vaccinated already, especially if it's a severe flu season. They may have gotten the message prior to pregnancy to get a vaccine. I think it comes up more often that somebody's due in August or September, and then it's, you know, as an adult, they certainly would get a benefit from being vaccinated after pregnancy. It's the newborn benefit that you would get by vaccinating there a little bit early. Since there are no known harms to influenza vaccine during pregnancy, I'm not sure how you would even do a study if you were trying to look at people that have received two doses closer together in two separate flu seasons. I'm sure some of the people that talked yesterday about vaccine safety could come up with a study design, but I'm not sure practically from a clinical standpoint it's that big of a deal, nor is it going to be easy to study in a study setting because a lot of that has been done already.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen.
Thanks, Dr. Alt. I just want to maybe say that we can certainly look into some of our vaccine safety and other vaccine systems to give you guys in a follow-up meeting the frequency in which this happens and the timing in which this happens. I agree with you, Dr. Alt. We'll have to see what else we can glean from the data that we have, but we will certainly follow up on this question to understand this question for a following meeting. And I think at this point, we probably should move on to consider the language that is up here. Lisa, do you want to talk about how we typically vote for our influenza annual recommendations?
I would be happy to do that. There are some things that we generally don't vote on. What we typically do is vote on the overall, adopting the recommendations. It is unless there's something that is felt to need more discussion in the group. There's some things about which we don't have any options. For example, the strain changes, changes in licensure, we don't have any options about, and the vaccines are going to be available. The things that are malleable are, of course, the changes in language with regard to timing and contraindications and precautions, and co-administration. Although in that case, as I mentioned, we have followed the lead of the COVID-19 vaccine group.
Very good. So
generally what we
go ahead.
Oh no, sorry.
No, I was going to say so. The wording is before you, and I'll read it. The influenza vaccine vote. ACIP affirms the updated statement: prevention and control of seasonal influenza with vaccines. Recommendations of the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, United States 2020 to 21 influenza season. That will be the vote.
Isn't it 21 to 22?
Yeah, it's 21 to 22. So that has to be changed. We'll amend that before we throw it up for the vote. But that will be the vote that goes forward. So I'm going to need a motion. Oh, excuse me, Dr. Long, your hand is still up. And let me just say this. We don't mean to cut you off. We still have to go to the presentation by Dr. Santoli. If you send us the remainder of your questions, we'll pass them on to Dr. Grosskopf, unless you feel there's something that needs to be addressed at this moment.
No, I can do that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I need a motion from someone to accept the language. Dr. Fry, please go forward. I think you're on mute, Dr. Fry. Okay, while you're getting undone, Dr. Daly, you were second. We'll give you the
motion to accept the language as written.
Thank you very much. Hands down, please, and then I'd like to have a second, please, to the motion. Dr. Alt. Dr. Alt.
I second the motion.
Thank you, sir. All right, so the motion and seconded, and this will go on to a final vote. Now we'll turn to Dr. Santoli to please give us updates on the influenza VFC resolution. Dr. Santoli.
Hello there. So we're going to go over the updates to the VFC resolution that are proposed for influenza. Next slide. So you'll see in the presentation that the font that's in yellow represents where we have made changes compared to the prior version. Next slide. So the purpose is changed. The purpose of this resolution is to update the table of inactivated influenza vaccine in the VFC program and to update the section on contraindications and precautions for both inactivated influenza vaccine and live attenuated influenza vaccine. Next slide. There are no changes to the eligible groups or to the recommended vaccination schedule and intervals. Next slide. This table below has been updated to reflect the currently approved inactivated influenza vaccines in the VFC program, and it includes the age indication and reflects the updates that Dr. Grosskopf reviewed with the Flucelvax being indicated for ages 2 years and older. We also added another footnote at the bottom to just make clear and distinguish the inactivated influenza vaccine and LAIV as being egg-based, and then the Flucelvax as being cell-based. Next slide. The recommended intervals and dosages are unchanged. Next slide. Sorry. For the contraindications and precautions, in the contraindications, the changes which are shown in yellow divide the contraindications for egg-based from cell-based. And also we have updated in the egg-based, we have actually updated the link. Oh, excuse me, I walked away from the microphone, I apologize. We've updated the link to the more recent recommendations. And then for a new contraindication was added for cell culture-based influenza vaccines. That is a history of severe allergic reactions, e.g. anaphylaxis, to cell culture-based IIV or to any component of the vaccine. And then for the precautions, there's a new precaution that's been added for cell culture-based IIV, which is history of severe allergic reaction to any other influenza vaccine. Next slide. For the live attenuated section of the resolution, there are no changes to the eligible groups, no changes to the recommended vaccination schedule. Next slide. No changes to the intervals and recommended dosage. Next slide. We did update the link for the contraindications to be the 2021 ACIP statement. Next slide. And this is unchanged. It just indicates that when an updated recommendation is published for influenza vaccination within the next 6 months, that will be incorporated into this resolution by reference. And that concludes the overview of the resolution.
Very good. Do we have any specific wording up there that we need to put up for the motion? No. Okay. So do I have a motion to approve the presentation by Dr. Santoli? Thank you, Dr. Paling. Go ahead.
I would like to make a motion to approve the VFC resolution as described by Dr. Santoli. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hands down, everyone. And then I'd like a hand for a second, please. Dr. Bernstein?
I second the motion.
Very good.
That Dr. Paling articulated.
Thank you very much. So that ends this session, and we'll take a 5-minute break and return for the rabies vaccines session.